What are the causes and consequences of Lebanon's meltdown? How is the deepening crisis affecting ordinary life in the country? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute's interview program on current events, policy questions, and new ideas. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Nadya Sbaiti. Nadya Sbaiti is Assistant Professor of Middle Eastern Studies at the American University of Beirut. She specializes in the social and cultural history of the modern Middle East and is a co-founder and co-editor of Jadaliyya. Professor Nadya Sbaiti, it's a real pleasure to have you on the program.
It's a pleasure to be here, Mouin. Thank you so much for having me.
Lebanon seems to have been in crisis for several years now. First, there was the garbage crisis of 2015, then the mass demonstrations against new taxes in 2019, the Beirut port explosion last year, and now what is described by the World Bank as one of history's most severe economic meltdowns. You were until recently in Lebanon. We've all seen images of fuel shortages, power cuts, and now apparently water rationing as well. So I'd like to start by asking you, what is the impact of this crisis on daily life for ordinary Lebanese?
Yeah, that's such an important question to begin with. And just for the listeners to know, like I've been in Lebanon, I just left for a brief, break about 3 weeks ago. So I was there until about 3 weeks ago, and I'm obviously keeping in touch. The situation, as you've sort of outlined, and the impact on daily life, it's incredibly dire. So much so that even the generations who experienced and survived the 15-year civil war from 1975 to 1990 say that this is the worst period that they have ever lived through, like far worse than the circumstances of that war, which was also an armed conflict. So the garbage protests you sort of, began with in 2015, it's definitely a temporal marker that many people point to as kind of the beginning of this sort of long period that has resulted in this latest moment of crisis today. But it's important to note that even that crisis is rooted in the previous 30 years of collusion of state and private business interests in Lebanon. The result has been kind of an almost inexorable deterioration of people's quality of life in the 5 or 6 years in very particular ways. Whether as a result of garbage not being collected around the country for months, major environmental damage when it eventually was, which has also resulted in the extreme pollution of the Lebanese coastline, rendering all but a small percentage of it swimmable. And that's if you even have access to it as a resident.
Because of privatization.
Because of privatization, exactly. So the sort of the compounding of privatization, and the sort of extreme pollution that has happened in particular on the coastline there. In the last 18 to 20 months, this deterioration has ratcheted up, I think, almost exponentially, catalyzed by the banking and currency crisis, the COVID pandemic, and of course, the port explosion. Since the days of the protests, kind of euphoric days, looking back in the fall of 2019, residents of Lebanon have seen the lira lose over 90% of its value up until today, rendering lira-based salaries almost useless. In Lebanon today, there are at least 3 currency rates for the lira against the dollar, rendering any financial transaction an economic surprise at best and a labyrinth at worst. And that's when these transactions are even made possible. Prices have continued to rise over the last year. The state's most recent removal of subsidies on fuel, medicine, and bread have only made that worse. The state's provision of electricity, and as you mentioned, water, which was already being rationed since the end of the Civil War, worsened in the financial crisis to where over the last couple of weeks it's now being provided for as little as half an hour a day in some places, which means that generators have to fill in the rest of that time period. And fuel for generators, which have filled the void left by the lack of provision of state electricity, and they've been doing this for decades since the Civil War. The fuel is now selling at prohibitive prices on the black market, meaning that in the hottest part of the summer, in the midst of an ongoing pandemic, a multi-layered economic crisis, and in the wake of one of the most devastating non-nuclear explosions in modern history, Residents of Lebanon do not have regular access to electricity, to internet access by which to conduct educational or business functions, all while prices of food and medicine rise, while supplies of those very same things dwindle. So the last few weeks have witnessed, as you mentioned, a new visible sign with the gas lines, which stretch for blocks, if not miles, clogging everything from highways and residential streets, and making any kind of transportation to work or to school, or even just to try to get away for a while, a hassle. That's when it's even possible. Every time we think we've hit a rock bottom in Lebanon, it just turns into a trap door. And so that's kind of what the situation is at right now.
But you seem to be describing kind of this double vice grip of not only prohibitively expensive prices, but also dwindling and increasingly inaccessible supply, even for those who perhaps would be able to afford some of these essential goods.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so there's nothing if not a plethora of inconsistencies and contradictions in this whole situation. So if you have a supply of dollars, whether you're earning that in dollars or you have someone who can sort of provide that, you are able to sort of access certain kinds of supplies probably more easily and more readily. But if there's nothing to access, then it doesn't matter what currency you have, or you just find kind of back doors or back windows to sort of try to get those. I mean, one of the things that's interesting is one of the things that's been a severe shortage over the last few months is for example baby formula, and miraculously you go to a pharmacy and there's been nothing on the shelf, or they will only sell you one at a prohibitive cost. But when the subsidies were lifted, miraculously, things came back on the shelf again. And that's because,
profits to be made.
Profits to be made. People have, so shop owners or pharmacy owners, we're just not putting them on the shelves, waiting for this precise moment to where they can then put them back and charge a different price. Yeah.
And that's, quite dramatic that you say people who lived through the Civil War describe the current situation as being even worse.
Yeah.
And on that note, I'd like to turn to the causes of the crisis and get your views on that. Many people describe Lebanon as a country that's essentially run by a confessional political elite that's more or less unaccountable to the people, despite the existence of an elected parliament. Others point to Lebanon's opaque financial sector, and still others say it's a combination of the two, with the added factor of Lebanon being the victim of regional polarization, particularly between Saudi Arabia and Iran. In your view, what are the main causes of the crisis? Is it a combination of all of these? Are there perhaps other factors we should be aware of?
I mean, I think to really get into the causes of the crisis, we have to actually go quite a ways back. It's further back even than 2015, right? Lebanon's current economic system and current political system, right? Or in the sense that they're now sort of intertwined in a very particular way, was basically set up in the way that we know it today in the 1990s after the end of the Civil War. Exactly, right, and what ensued precisely. It instituted policies whereby the country relied heavily and continues to rely heavily on imports for most of its consumption, food, medical needs. This discourages local production, led to also a incredible dependency on foreign currency, in particular of dollars. And exactly, right? It's a magic combination. This happened also to privilege a small class of business interests, many of whom also were, helped amass some of their profits and wealth during the Civil War. So this is also cannot be divorced from the period prior to the 1990s. Bank owners, importers, real estate developers, small business interests, who are also closely connected to the political class, right? If not necessarily overlapping with them. And these groups amassed enormous profits in the last, 30 to 35 years or so that led to the crippling of a number of sectors, those sectors that help create jobs. There's been almost no diversification, which has led to the crisis today, where we've become extremely heavily dependent on those dollar inflows. growing income inequality over the last 25 years. And then when those inflows, with those dollar inflows began to slow, and then ultimately kind of more or less, have halted starting in the fall of 2019, the system basically
before the COVID pandemic.
Before, yes. The currency, the rate of lira to the dollar began to change in, as far as I remember, back like as early as October and November of 2019. So it was also during, and of course was one of the things that also continued to, contribute and fuel the protests that were happening in that period. So yeah, the system has essentially, for lack of a better term, crumbled since then. The poverty rate has doubled in 18 months. Rates of food insecurity are unprecedented for the country. Rates of immigration have soared due to either Immigration, yes, to leaving outside the country. Yes, definitely no immigration into the country. We can talk about that as well, but here I'm talking about immigration due to job loss or salaries that basically have little to no purchasing power, right? Due to hyperinflation, shortages of fuel, electricity, medicine, baby formula, as I was mentioning. Children's immunizations now have just recently been notified that those are also at a standstill, and basically all of this points to a middle class that was already shrinking and is now basically experiencing actual poverty. And the military and the police, I just want to add incidentally, have not been spared any of these shortages of either salaries, foodstuffs, products, etc. Throughout Lebanon, there are far fewer jobs, far fewer economic opportunities. And the banking and currency crisis also means that the savings of most of Lebanese society has been completely decimated, if not depleted. So the middle and lower classes, right, are being sort of squeezed in this double vice, as you were saying. And the business and the political class, in the meantime, are benefiting from the system, continue to plunder the economy as they have been for the last 3 decades, storing their wealth safely abroad. Many of them were able to transfer much of that wealth from Lebanese banks, even after the banks told the public that they could not do so. And people have resorted to basically higher rates of smuggling, hoarding, all of which is making, an unequal society even more so and far more polarized. And a huge part of the situation today, to get back to your question, is the total lack of accountability for much of this, right? And here, without going into too much detail, I'll just say, Saudi Arabia and Iran, who you brought up in your question, they certainly have, a role, but they are very much part of this larger environment. And so I find that trying to apportion or even sort of equally distribute blame onto those two countries is actually detracting necessarily from this larger picture, which is that this is actually the system in which they are,
and it's primarily, involved. In your view, a domestic crisis rather than one that's has its origins outside Lebanon.
Certainly. There are external contributors, absolutely, whether you want to talk about Saudi Arabia, Iran, the US, or France, but certainly this has a much longer history than either the last 18 months or the last 6 years. This goes back at, a number of decades. And again, a huge part of the situation and the causes of the crisis is this also decades of lack of accountability. And I'll just bring that back to the port explosion, right? Which happened last August 4th of 2020. It killed over 200 people, injured somewhere around the neighborhood of 6,000, and displaced 300,000 residents. And for months after the blast, hundreds of households were in tatters, their residents remained displaced. A World Bank assessment a few months later reported that 14,000 housing units were fully destroyed, 25,000 were structurally damaged, over 130,000 housing units needed repair. All of this in the midst of a pandemic and a financial crisis that made those exact repairs financially challenging, if not impossible. And on August 4th, in less than a month, it will be a year since the explosion, and there has been zero accountability.
You focused quite a bit on, I don't know what you would like to call it, oligarchy, kleptocracy, what you will, and that you have this class of vested interests that have managed to basically gobble up most of the Lebanese budget and foreign assistance. Have we seen, in the context of the current crisis, significant capital flight to foreign banks? And if so, have there been any efforts to seek accountability in that sphere?
We've seen a lot of it, sure, absolutely, to foreign banks in the sense, but primarily from particular cadres or particular business and political classes, to the best of our knowledge. Certainly, the sort of average checking account holder, let's say in a Lebanese bank, has been unable, right, has been prohibited officially from transferring any savings or any of the financial any of their salaries, essentially, anything that they have spent years or decades of their life putting away to any external bank. Those who have been it's been laborious, it's been painstaking, it's also been quite ad hoc. It's on a case-by-case basis, depending on such particular situation, your relationship to the bank, etc. And so that means that also people whose savings or whose salaries are still being or cannot be transferred out but remain in the banks, have also lost over 90% of their value. And so
because they're held in local currency.
Held in local currency, exactly.
And then are people at least able to access the money that they do have in their accounts in Lebanon, or are there also controls on that?
There have been various kinds of controls on that since the fall of 2019. One of the remarkable things about the fall of 2019 during the uprising was that banks closed within a couple of days of the protests beginning, which officially, at least in this narrative, were on October 17th. And by the 19th of October, the banks were closed. And this is also remarkable, given that in 15 years of civil war, banks never closed.
Sounds like a political move.
It sounds, it's a little political, yeah. And also, just drove home to a lot of the public, a lot of the protesters, especially, right, that what they had long kind of suspected and known, that the banks are in bed with the politicians, is in fact precisely the case. But just to go back to your question, yes, there have been multiple kinds of controls that have been put in place over the last 18 months. Which included, ranging from being unable to then withdraw dollars, to basically putting different kinds of limits on how many liras you could withdraw from an ATM or from a bank in a week.
Sorry, just to clarify, this is to be able to use that money within Lebanon rather than to transfer it abroad.
Definitely within Lebanon, right, right. And then, yes, precisely.
If we look now at the official level, the current Prime Minister, Hassan Diab, resigned almost a year ago, but has remained in a caretaker role because the Lebanese parties and their foreign sponsors have been unable to agree on a new government and its composition. In your view, what are the main obstacles to the formation of a new Lebanese government that might be able to begin to address this crisis?
What's so kind of funny, if you don't care what funny means in this context, is that Hassan Diab warned a few days ago that Lebanon was on the brink of "quote unquote" a social explosion, but this is an explosion that is above all political and decades in the making, right? So yes, Diab is caretaker prime minister in a government of elites who've plundered the state for decades, really. Many of them, again, as I mentioned, having also made their wealth during the civil war, and then have gone through various steps since then to both keep it and augment it. The main obstacles are, again, collusion of state, business, and banking cadres, and the overlaps between them. And that has come with it. I don't want to, it's easy to sort of remain at that sort of level of sort of macro level of these different classes. So I want to actually bring it back down and say, this has carried with it, at best, complete obliviousness, and at worst, true kind of malicious neglect and lack of responsibility towards citizens and residents of Lebanon that they're supposed to be representing and safeguarding. Political leaders who've amassed this wealth during and after the war, and who continue to represent, what had been former wartime militias and parties, and which then morphed into political parties, who mediate their constituencies' access to resources through their confessional political communities. This is who is in power at this point, and have been for decades. And in this regard, the pandemic and this financial crisis, which was also of their making, right, have played also perfectly into their interests. So just as an example, whatever ideological gains were made in the uprising in the fall of 2019 were rolled back once the pandemic hit. Even when the financial crisis had already sort of been clearly was snowballing. When the pandemic hit, right, sectarian party leaders began promising food and other supplies to loyal constituents. And so this was also whatever gains, and there were gains, I do believe that had been made in the fall and winter of 2019. By early 2020, February, March for sure, a lot of these were being sort of rolled back, and party leaders very cynically took advantage of these, layered crises to reassert, right, to roll back those gains and to reassert their power over the constituencies. Yeah.
And I think the government and security forces also used the pandemic as a welcome pretext to ban public gatherings and further demonstrations and so on.
Absolutely. And external and powers like France and the US and others who are alleged to have Lebanon's best interests at heart need to stop supporting these very same political and business classes they purport to criticize.
Yeah, and that was in fact my next question. I would like to devote one question to the role of the Western powers in this crisis, particularly France and the United States. France, of course, being the former colonial power in Lebanon, has proposed various initiatives to address the crisis, but has been faulted for relying on the same confessional political elite that you've described as basically being responsible for where we are today. In the case of the United States, the criticism is somewhat different in that Washington is accused of making matters considerably worse with the whole raft of sanctions it has imposed upon a large number of Lebanese institutions. How do you see the role of France and the United States in particular?
I mean, I think you've said it really well, Mouin. France and the US and others, right, keep saying the right things in a certain definition of right, but their actions belie these tepid critiques. And in terms of France they both relied on the same political elites. You mentioned this in the France's case, but I think that even with the US, imposing sanctions on institutions and even individuals in the Lebanese government and the political elite, this has gone nowhere, frankly. And in the meantime, they continue to have dealings with the very same institutions and elites and government officials that they are rightfully criticizing, and yet simultaneously are actually not taking any steps to tangibly sort of change anything sort of on the ground. A few weeks ago, and I think this was in your introduction, right, the World Bank stated that Lebanon is enduring one of the worst economic depressions in modern history, I think since the 19th century.
One of the 3 or 4 worst since 1850, I think, was there.
Yeah. And it's amazing because, of course, the World Bank has been part and parcel of mobilizing
so they know what they're talking about.
Going back, right, in some version, well over a century, I think. Very much part of the making of the crisis in Lebanon, as well as, of course, other crises that are similar in other parts of the world. We're months, years into, I think, even optimistically speaking, is going to be nearly a decade of financial crisis and attempted recovery. And everything that includes about a society's sense of precarity and insecurity and the way that societies, have historically kind of attempted to deal with that, and which we're seeing play out in some of the clashes and the violence that we're hearing about today in Lebanon. Right. What's hilarious is that Diab is also pleading with the international community to come and save Lebanon, glibly ignoring that he and his entire, class of political, entire class of political and business interests are responsible for the multiple layered crises that are happening. And the very international community being begged to come and save them, like France and the US or the World Bank, right, aided and abetted this precise cadre of people for the last 3 decades, in helping to bring Lebanon to this point of crisis. And of course, the death and maiming of those impacted along the way. And most recently, but of course, it's not going to be the last part, of the port explosion last year. We need an overhaul to Lebanon's system to change the relationship between the political and business classes, to change the relationship between what people believe is possible and who they can believe makes it possible. We need a state that doesn't mediate its relationship to its residents through religious or sectarian communities and leaders, an economy that is productive as opposed to precarious and in the hands of a few interests, and a sense of social economic justice, right? And I'll just say, folks in Lebanon, by the way, are completely aware of this. During the 2019 uprising, there were palpable game plans that were put forth, right? Imagining a different and better future for and in Lebanon. So it's not that nobody can figure out what's needed. It's a question of what are the circumstances that can be brought about in order to make that happen. And the US and France could be part of that, but so far we have yet to see that happen.
Don't hold your breath, in other words. Just one issue I'd also like to bring up is that one reason, of course, that Lebanon has been in the news often in recent years is the very large influx of refugees. You, of course, have had since the late 1940s a large population of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, and more recently, a large influx of Syrian refugees. And I'd just like to ask, given how devastating this crisis has been to Lebanon's own citizens, I presume it's had an even worse impact on non-citizen refugees, and presumably has also led to even less assistance coming to them from abroad in the context of the pandemic and so on.
Yeah.
What have you? What is your sense of how this crisis is impacting those communities?
It's as, if not more, devastating, certainly to the refugee communities, particularly those that are sort of living together in either official or makeshift sort of refugee spaces and camps, for sure. So that includes Palestinians and Syrian refugees, and it also includes migrant workers from places like everywhere, as broadly ranged as Sudan to Sri Lanka and Ethiopia. And if we were to sort of talk about them as a group for a moment, their already sort of original precarity has been exacerbated to an unbelievable degree by the financial crisis, and by the pandemic, and living in particularly dense quarters, and not being seen by institutions and organizations, whether international or local, as populations that are prioritized for any kind of safety or vaccination campaigns necessarily. This is also really hard to gauge at the same time, because figures and reports about these communities, whether in refugee camps or in makeshift places like the Bekaa, for example, are very hard to come by. There has been it's really hard to get any kind of information about what the exact impact, whether through quantitative data or any kinds of assessments about what exactly the degree of precarity and suffering is, but it's certainly there. Yeah.
And finally, Nadya, I'd like to ask you. You spoke, I think, quite powerfully a few minutes ago about what you think should happen and how this crisis could be addressed. But I think there's also another question of what you think will actually happen in the coming period. We've seen, these very dramatic statements from the World Bank and the Prime Minister and others about what might be expected in the short term. If you were to look at Lebanon in the coming months, 12 to 18 months, what's your prognosis about where the country and its society are headed?
Yeah, this is hard to speak to without sounding like it's a cop out, in the sense that it's really hard to predict the future, and it's not something that I'm necessarily prone to doing. At the same time that, as I mentioned earlier with the sort of trapdoor analogy, I've been away for 3 weeks, and in the last 3 weeks, it's gotten far worse than even was when I was there. So my sense is things will continue to get worse for
Well,
quite a while longer. Yeah.
if I could maybe phrase the question a little differently, for those of us who are trying to keep tabs, so to speak, on Lebanon, what are the main issues we should be looking for to get a sense of where things are heading?
I would suggest, okay, so I would suggest keeping an eye out for, apart from the sort of larger news agencies and the issuances from major organizations like the World Bank, or from governmental papers, or think tanks, for example, many of whom are very closely monitoring what's happening, to also pay attention to, there's an incredible amount of activity. One of the things that is also kind of incredible and miraculous and should be noted and celebrated is that people in Lebanon are enacting miracles every day in the middle of this incredible moment. They're continuing to help each other, to organize, to write, and to fundraise, and to put information out there. And so I would say, to keep an eye out on local writers, newspapers, and journalists, and opinion writers who are writing from Lebanon, in Lebanon, including blog posts, including our Jadaliyya, and also there are multiple now organizations that are putting out sort of networks for people who would like to kind of hire or work with folks who are on the ground in Lebanon, to where they are kind of providing whatever support they can from afar, whether it's financial or any kind of other support. And I would say that there are now a ton of those organizations that are putting out these kinds of networks. Yeah, I just want to add here, if I can,
Please. Yeah.
I just want to add one last thing on that note, which is to add my voice to a number of people who've spoken out over the last couple of weeks, in particular, addressing people who have in the last few weeks been, kind of accusing people in Lebanon of being either apathetic or complacently kind of accepting this fate. And I would say, I think in general, people are kind of, at the one hand, bogged down with what feels like the impossibility of being able to sort of live and survive this period and find a livelihood and also find meaning in what they're doing, along with a legacy of suppression of protest, and also to pay attention to the different ways that protest can be defined, and the different ways that pushback and movement can be defined. And so I will say that the best way to keep tabs on what's going on over the next several months, as you asked, is to pay attention, to broaden our definition of what that movement might look like, and what protest and political work might look like.
Nadya Sbaiti, thank you very much for sharing your views with Connections.
Thank you so much, Mouin. It's been a pleasure.